Good evening. We're here in San Antonio, Texas, with the Handy family, and at least one of their dogs, and several of their geese, and a lot of their chickens, and some horses too. And Kai likes scary stories, so we're gonna probably do some ghost tales shortly. But first, I thought I would do some music because I've been having a really great music day. I went down to the Alamo and it was all under wraps. We couldn't get anywhere near it, couldn't get close, but we went to Missions, which is a national parks place. It was incredible. I would put that on your bucket list if you're heading down to San Antonio. But now we're up above San Antonio, the very, very northern section, and watching that beautiful sunset. I hope you can see that. And I thought we'd do a little music too. One of my favorite ghost stories is Mary Calhaine. See, once a long, long time ago, there was a village beside a hill. And in this village there were only 4 houses. And each of those houses looked exactly like the other house. They had a large room that they did up pretty much everything in, and a small room that was kind of for cooking. And the geese usually stayed out in the yard. But sometimes they got really loud, especially the gander. Yeah, and he would come in and he would honk right by those kitchens, right by the kitchen window. But nobody could do anything because they didn't even have a kitchen door. These houses only had one door. It was right in the front. Well, they actually had a ladder going up to the upper part where they had 2 lofts. Yeah, one on one side, that was for the parents. And on the other side, that one was for the children. Now, the people in that village, they didn't work in the village. No. If they had a job, they had to go to the other side of the hill where there was a town. So that meant every day they either had to walk around that hill, all the way around, or they had to walk over the hill. But I'm going to tell you, most of the people, they walked around the hill. Because at the top of the hill was a graveyard. And the people, they did not like walking through a graveyard, especially on the way home from work where it might get dark. Well, I should say, most of them didn't like walking through that graveyard. Most of them wouldn't go over the hill. But one of them would. That was Mr. Calhaine. See, Mr. Calhaine, he wasn't scared of graveyard, even at night. Well, that's what he said. And every morning he'd climb up that hill, he'd go through that graveyard, and he'd go on down to work. And every evening he'd climb that hill, he'd go through the graveyard, he'd go on down to home. And this one particular day, Mr. Calhaine, he'd climbed that hill after work, and he was walking through the graveyard when he felt this uncommon weariness, this exhaustion just came over him as he walked through the graveyard. And as he was walking by this open grave, he was suddenly so overwhelmed with weariness that he just leaned up against a tree and he slid down the tree. He didn't know how long he slept, but he slept, and when he woke up it was already getting dark. So he jumps up, he runs through that graveyard, he runs down the hill, he runs to his house, and he gets there. His family's all sitting around waiting for supper.
Owl.
Woo! And owl. We're having a lot of people coming into this
Geese
story.
and owls.
He just soared right up. I watched him do it.
So beautiful.
Mr. Calhaine, he goes on in and he goes into his house, and there's his family sitting around the table, and Mr. Calhaine, he sits down at the table, but he doesn't eat. And his wife, she looks over at him, she says, honey, what's wrong? And he says, well, as I was walking through the graveyard, every night I was walking through the graveyard, and as I walking past this open grave, I just got overcome with weariness, and I leaned up against a tree and I fell asleep, and when I woke up it was so late I keep running down here and I forgot my walking stick. I left it there in the middle of the graveyard. It's my father's walking stick. I so would hate to lose it in the night. And then he looks around the table at all his children, and hoping one of them will volunteer to go up into the graveyard in the dark and get his walking stick. And all the kids, they get their faces down on their plates and they're eating away, all except Mary. Mary Calhaine. So she just jumps up, says, Daddy, I'll get your walking stick. She's out the door, and she's up the hill, and it's dark. And it's hard for her to find her way around and over the wall into the graveyard, and she's working her way through that graveyard. And finally she sees the open grave. And she heads on over to that open grave, and she sees her dad's walking stick. So she reaches down to pick up that walking stick, and she hears a voice. She hears a voice coming from the open grave. It says, put down that walking stick, Mary, and help me out of the grave. Help me out of the grave, Mary. Mary Calhaine. And she didn't want to. But her body began to move all by itself. She had to. It moved right to the open grave. And when she got there, her waist bent and her back leaned down, and her hands reached down into that black pit, and she felt the cold, clammy, bony, fleshless fingers of a corpse. And it began climbing up her arms, and it climbed up onto Mary's back. It wrapped its arms around her neck, its legs around her waist, and it said, take me down to your village, Mary. Down to your village, Mary Calhaine. And she didn't want to. But she had to. Her feet moved on their own. It turned her around and headed her off, and she climbed over the wall and started down the hill to the village. And the thing clung on her back all the time, saying, move along, Mary, down into the village. Until they got down to the path in the village. And it pointed at the first house in the village. It pointed to that first door. It said, take me into that house. Take me into the house, Mary. Take me into the house, Mary Calhaine. And she didn't want to. But she had to. Her feet moved her to that door, and she reached over and she reached for that latch. And as she reached for that door, as she reached for that latch, the creature said, wait! I smell the smell of holy water. I can't go in there. Take me to the next house, Mary. Take me to the next house, Mary Calhaine. And she didn't want to. But she had to carry that creature down the path and up the next path until she came to that next door. She reached for that latch. She reached for that door. As she reached for that latch, she heard the creature say, no! I smell the smell of holy water. I can't go in there. Take me to the next house, Mary. Mary Calhaine. And she didn't want to. But she had to, back down the path and up the path to the next house. And as she reached out her hand for that latch, as she reached for that door, she reached for the latch, she heard the creature say, oh, Mary, no holy water here. Take me inside, Mary. Take me inside. Mary Calhaine. And this time she didn't mind so much because the next house was hers. And so she lifted the latch and she opened the door and she walked into that big room and she could kind of hear the breath of the mother and father up in the loft. She could kind of hear the breath of the children, the 3 boys in the other loft. But they just breathed on. The creature, he climbed off of Mary's back and he slid down into a chair at a table. And he said, "Go into the kitchen, Mary, and get me something to eat and something to drink. Get it, Mary. Mary Calhaine." And her feet took her into the kitchen where she found a little bit of oatmeal and she made it up. Then looked around for something to drink, but there was just the oatmeal and the dirty dishwater, and so she put the oatmeal into a bowl and she carried it back out. And as she came out of the kitchen, the creature said, "Oh, there's my food. Where's my drinks? Where's my drinks, Mary?" Mary said, "There was only enough water to make the oatmeal, and now the only water in there is the dirty dishwater. I didn't think you wanted that." He said, "Nothing to drink? They've left me nothing to drink. Then go back inside and fetch me a knife and another bowl. Get it, Mary. Mary Calhaine." And she didn't want to, but she had to go into that kitchen again and take a knife and a bowl, and she carried them back out. And the creature, he climbed onto Mary's back, wrapped his arms around her neck, his legs around her waist, and he said, "Up the ladder, Mary, to the children's loft. Up the ladder, Mary. Mary Calhaine." And she didn't want to, but she had to climb up that ladder, up into the children's loft. And when she got into the loft, the creature, he climbed off of Mary's back and onto the bed where the 3 boys lay. And he reached under the covers and he pulled out their hands and he laid them on top of the sheet. And then he took that knife and he made a slit in the forefinger of each of those boys. Just a slit. And then he took that bowl and he put it underneath a finger and he squeezed out. He went to the next boy and he squeezed out a little. He squeezed out a little blood, and as he squeezed out the blood, the air left their bodies. And he crawled back across the bed and he squeezed out a little more blood. He squeezed out a little more blood into that bowl, and as he squeezed out a little blood from each of those boys, the color left their faces. And he squeezed out. And he squeezed out a little bit more blood into that bowl, and as he squeezed out that 3rd bit of blood, the heat left their bodies and they laid there still and lifeless. And then the creature, he crawled back across the bed, back onto Mary's back, wrapped his arms around her neck, his legs around her waist, and he said, "Take me back down the ladder, Mary. Down the ladder, Mary Calhaine." And this time she kind of wanted to. She wanted to get away from those bodies. And so she climbed down to the ladder, and the creature, he climbed back off Mary's back, wrapped back into the chair, and he took that bowl of oatmeal, and he took that bowl of blood, and he poured the blood into the oatmeal, and he mixed it together. And then he took that ball of bloody oatmeal, and he broke it in half, and he put half in one bowl and half in the other. And he took that second bowl of oatmeal and he slid it across the table and he said, "Eat it, Mary. Eat it, Mary Calhaine." And she didn't want to. But she had to. Her hands were moving on their own. One reached into the bowl and grabbed a clump of that bloody oatmeal and started bringing it up to her mouth. Her mouth opened up as it came to her lips. She took her other hand and she slapped the first hand. The oatmeal fell out of her fingers down into her blouse. And it gave her an idea. She looked up. The creature was busy eating his oatmeal. So she grabbed the whole thing with her other hand and she stuffed it down her blouse. And looked up. The creature looked up. "Are you done, Mary? Oh, good. And then, clean up these bowls. Clean them up. We don't want anyone to know we've been here. Clean, Mary. Clean them up. Mary Calhaine." And so she grabbed the two bowls and she took them into the kitchen and she washed them in that bit of dirty dishwater. She washed up the knife and she put the bowl and the knife away. And then she thought about that bloody oatmeal that was in her blouse, and she thought if she went back out with that oatmeal there, when the creature climbed on her back, he'd smell that oatmeal. He'd know she had it hidden there. So she reached into her pocket, she pulled out her handkerchief, and she pulled out the oatmeal and she wrapped it up in her handkerchief, and she took that bloody oatmeal and she put it in the top shelf, way in the back of the highest cupboard. And then walked out to face the creature again. And that creature, he climbed back on Mary's back, wrapped his arms around her neck, his legs around her waist, and he said, "Back to the graveyard, Mary. Back to the graveyard, Mary Calhaine." And she didn't want to, but she had to walk out of the house. And as she left the house behind, the creature, he pointed ahead. "Do you see that field there? On the other side of the path? The one with the 3 piles of stones? Underneath each of those piles is the king's ransom in gold. But nobody knows of it except the dead." Mary didn't like the sound of that because she wasn't dead yet. Mary said, "Creature, those boys, are they really dead? Or, I mean, everything I ever heard or read about says there's always some way to undo a magic like that, and some way of bringing them back, some way of breaking the enchantment. Isn't there some way?" And the creature said, "Oh, Mary, you're so smart. There used to be a way, but not anymore. You see, if somebody had taken some of that bloody oatmeal and pressed it to their lips 3 times, why, they'd be fine. Never know of their deaths. But nobody can, because we ate it." And Mary didn't say anything at all to that. But the creature was heavy, and Mary had been carrying it around most of the night. And now she was trying to go up the hill, and it wasn't easy. And every time she'd trip or stumble, the creature would start pinching her with his bony fingers, pinching at her, saying, "Hurry along, Mary! Hurry along, Mary Calhaine!" But she couldn't hurry. She was tripping, sometimes falling, and didn't it hurt when she landed on her knees in the darkness? Oh, but the creature, he'd batter at the ears. "Hurry along, Mary! Hurry along, Mary Calhaine!" And so she tried and climbed up the hill as best she could till she came to the wall. And as she came to that wall, she heard a noise coming from the village below. The creature said, "What was that?" "Oh, I think it was an owl looking for some food." "I don't think it was, Mary. Hurry along! Hurry along, Mary Calhaine!" And over the wall she went. And as she was walking through the graveyard, she thought she heard the sound again. "What was that?" I'm sure it was just a lamb bleating for its mother. No, Mary, hurry along! Hurry along! And then they came to the edge of that open grave. And the creature said, oh, Mary, we're here. And now it's time for you to join me in the grave. He didn't like that. And as he slid off of Mary's back around to her front, he grabbed a hold of her wrist and he said, come with me, Mary. Come with me into the grave. And she didn't want to. But she couldn't help herself. Her waist bent, her knees bent, her arms reached down into that darkness, and she watched her hands disappear into those black holes, her arms, her face. And just as she came to the edge of that hole, she heard the sound again, and the creature roared, oh, Mary! If I had known the rooster would crow 3 times before I got you into the grave, I never would have told you about the gold. Then he dropped lifeless into the pit. Mary, she pulled herself back from the grave and found her father's walking stick. Used it to help her up. Used it to help her home. The sun was coming up over the trees, and she came into her house, and she made her way up the loft into her bed. She fell asleep there with her clothes on. Her mother found her there later. Mary, what's wrong? Oh, Mary, you look like you've seen a ghost. Stay in bed. Rest. In the night, the neighbor's boys, all 3 of them died. We have to go over for the wake, but Mary, you just stay here. There's some food downstairs if you want some breakfast. Well, Mary, she stayed in bed. She slept till afternoon. And when she finally did wake up, she went downstairs, she fixed herself a bit to eat, and then she went over next door to the wake. In the house, it was full of all the people that lived in the village, and half the people from the town, too. They were all packed into that little house, and Mary, she could barely make her way through the room, and she worked her way over to the mother of the 3 boys, and she said, well, what would you give to have your children back again? The mother said, Mary, how can you talk like this? Mary, how can you say such a thing? I just lost my children, and you, how can you say such a thing? Mary said, even so, would you give me that field across the way, the one with the 3 piles of stones, if I brought your children back? The woman said, Mary, I would give anything for my children back, but you can't bring them back. Mary said, put it in writing. And that got the woman's attention. And so she wrote on a piece of paper, if Mary could bring her children back to life, she'd give her the field across the way with the 3 piles of stone. And as soon as Mary had that paper in her hand, she said, everyone out! And she went into the kitchen, and she took down that handkerchief with the bloody oatmeal in it, and she carried it up the ladder into the loft. And she sat down on the bed, and she opened that handkerchief, and she pulled out a clump of that bloody oatmeal, and she pressed it. She pressed it to the lips of those boys. She pressed it to their lips. And as she pressed that bit of oatmeal to their lips, the heat came back into their body. And she took another glob of that oatmeal and she pressed it to their lips. And as she pressed that glob of oatmeal, as she pressed it to their lips, the color came back into their skin. And she took the last bit of oatmeal and she pressed it to their lips. And as she pressed that oatmeal to their lips, as she pressed it, the air came back into their lungs and they were lying there asleep. And Mary, she called the mother back into the house. The mother came charging up the ladder. So did all the people in the village and half the people from the town. They're all crowded around, wondering how this could be. And Mary said to the mother, she said, call them. Call them by their names. And the mother said, Tom, John, James. And as she called their names, their eyes opened up. They looked around and wondered why all those people were in their loft. Well, that wake turned into a party that lasted for 3 days. And sometime after that, Mary, she went over to her field and she dug up some of that gold. Yeah. She used it to build herself a house there in the village. And she used a little more to help the other people in the village. And she used a lot more to build a church right there in the village. So there'd always be a good supply of holy water for everyone in the village. Yeah, Mary always kept holy water by her door. And she never went up in the graveyard again at night. And she never, ever, ever ate oatmeal again. But that's the story of Mary Calhaine, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for being my guest tonight. And thank you folks out there. I hope you enjoyed it too.
Yay!